Welcome to the first screencast on F214, the hormones unit. The first slide here define the terms endocrine gland, exocrine gland, hormone, target tissue. Dealing with these in turn, let's deal with endocrine gland and exocrine gland first of all. The difference between these two types of gland is that an endocrine gland releases its secretions directly into the bloodstream. So here we have cells of an endocrine nature which are releasing their secretion, which in this case would be a hormone, and that hormone is released into capillaries, which are then taken up by the venous supply and returned to the general circulation, and then pumped in the general circulation around the body, where they come into contact with cells throughout the body. Okay, that is an endocrine gland. Okay, so all of the glands that produce hormones would be examples of endocrine glands. So things like the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the testes and testosterone, ovaries with estrogen and progesterone. These will be all examples of endocrine glands. Okay, so they are structures that release hormones directly into the blood. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, have cells which are clustered around ducts. Okay, and these ducts, the secretions of these exocrine glands are released into the duct, and then the duct takes that secretion somewhere. Okay, so for example, a lot of exocrine glands are clustered around the digestive tract. So we have things like gastric pits, salivary glands. The pancreas, as we'll discover, has got an exocrine function. Okay, so the enzymes which are produced by the salivary gland, amylase, would be an example of a substance produced in a cell here, which is then released into a salivary duct and then is taken to the mouth. Similarly, the pancreas releases lipase and proteases and amylases, which are released into ducts, which are then taken to the pancreatic duct, which then eventually gets into the small intestine. So that's an exocrine gland. Okay, a hormone. A hormone is a substance which is released by an endocrine gland, and it's released by an endocrine cell, and it's released into the blood, as we've just said, and then it passes through the bloodstream, where it then links up with a target cell. Now, for some of those target cells, the hormones have receptors on the cell surface of the target cell. Okay, so all the water-soluble hormones, which wouldn't be able to get through the cell surface membrane, have receptor molecules which are specific and complementary in shape to that hormone on the cell surface membrane of the target cell. Okay. Some hormones, however, those which have cholesterol as a structural basis, what we call steroid hormones, are fat soluble and can pass straight through that phospholipid bilayer, and they can actually have target receptors inside the cell cytoplasm. Okay, so sometimes the target is actually inside the cell cytoplasm, but for many hormones they are receptor molecules on the surface of the membranes, the cell surface membranes. Okay, so that's what a hormone is. Moving down to talk about target cells. As I've just said, an endocrine cell secretes a hormone, and that's released into the blood. And a target cell, by definition, is a cell which has some form of receptor for that particular hormone. As we've said just above, sometimes those receptors are on the cell surface membrane, sometimes they're actually within the cell itself. However, there needs to be some sort of receptor which recognises the presence of the hormone. Okay, and if it has such a receptor, we call it a target cell, as opposed to cells which don't have a receptor for that particular hormone would be non-target cells. Okay, because they don't have receptors. Okay, so hopefully that defines those. So just quickly going back up to the top, just to give you the summary of the slide, and you can pause here and make your own notes. Okay, so the endocrine gland secretes a hormone directly into the blood, doesn't have any ducts. Okay, insulin from the pancreas, which we'll look at later. Pituitary gland, you come across things like FSH, LH, ADH, all released from the pituitary gland. Exocrine gland, these secrete molecules into ducts that carries molecules to a site of action. And the example I've given you here are enzymes from the pancreas, but also salivary gland would be an example of an exocrine gland. Hormone is a molecule released from an endocrine gland into the blood and acts as a messenger, as we'll describe. It's known as a first messenger, as we'll discover on a subsequent slide, and carries a signal to some form of target tissue. And I've also said steroid hormones have a site of action within the cell because they're fat soluble and can pass through phospholipid bilayer membranes. And then the target tissue are cells which have the specific receptor molecule. Okay. When we look at the pancreas in the next screen cast, we'll discover that the pancreas is interesting in that it's got endocrine function. The insulin and the glucagon that it produces are the endocrine function of the pancreas, but it also has an exocrine function. There are other cells, the pancreatic acini as they're known, which we'll look at later, produce things like lipases, trypsin, and amylases, which are enzymes which are taken in the pancreatic duct to the small intestine. Moving on to the next slide. This slide deals with what happens once a hormone or any messenger has bound to a receptor molecule. The example here, we deal with a receptor molecule which is actually on a cell surface membrane, and the example deals with adrenaline. Okay, and just before I start this slide, some of the diagrams and some of the animations I use in this slide are American, and they use the word epinephrine instead of adrenaline. Okay, so Americans don't tend to use the word adrenaline; they use the word epinephrine instead. Although they do talk about the adrenal glands as we do, but so if you come across the word epinephrine, that means adrenaline. Okay, so first of all, first messengers. Okay, so example of a communication system, we talk about the first messenger and the second messenger. The first messenger is the hormone which transmits the signal between cells, okay, so around the body. Okay, so adrenaline, for example, will be a hormone released by the adrenal glands, and it has its effect on various target cells around the body. What we're particularly interested in here is what actually happens after the hormone has bound to this cell surface membrane. What happens then? And the answer is that a second messenger is released within the cell, and that second messenger signals for various metabolic processes to occur within the cell, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. And the example you've got to know deals with a particular communication system where adrenaline binds to a cell surface receptor and activates via another protein, activates an enzyme which is called adenyl cyclase, which then converts ATP into a substance called cyclic AMP, and that cyclic AMP acts as a second messenger in the cell which switches on enzymes and directs metabolic activity within the cell. Okay, so hopefully the diagrams and various animations will illustrate that. So here we have an example of a first messenger here, which could be adrenaline. Again, remember I talked about Americans using the word epinephrine instead of adrenaline. Okay, we will use the word adrenaline. Okay, so ignore epinephrine and just think of adrenaline. So here's our adrenaline molecule, binds to its cell surface receptor molecule, and what that does is it activates another messenger molecule, okay, which is called a G protein, which then activates an enzyme called adenyl cyclase. Okay, so this binds to this, which then releases this, which binds to that, and adenyl cyclase then starts catalyzing the reaction, which converts ATP into a molecule called cyclic AMP. And it's the cyclic AMP which acts as the second messenger inside the cell, which activates other proteins. Okay, and what happens is that a series of activations occur which amplify the signal, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. Okay, so just moving on, this is all illustrated in the little animation I've got here.
When a signal molecule, such as epinephrine, binds to a cell surface receptor protein, it activates a G protein on the inside of the cell. The G protein then stimulates adenylyl cyclase to produce large amounts of cyclic AMP from ATP within the cell. The cyclic AMP then binds to and activates a target protein, such as alpha kinase, which adds phosphates to specific proteins in the cell. The effect of this phosphorylation depends on the identity of the cell and the proteins that are phosphorylated.
Now, depending on what the cell is, this protein here that's been activated will do some form of metabolic process within the cell. Now, for example, in a liver cell responding to adrenaline, as we know, adrenaline increases blood glucose levels in the blood, and the way that it does that in liver cells is it converts glycogen to glucose, a process that we know to be called glycogenolysis. So this cyclic AMP molecule would activate the enzyme, ultimately activate the enzyme which converts glycogen to glucose. Now, I mentioned below that one of the facets of this signal transduction pathway is that we are able to amplify the signal. I'll explain that in the diagram below here. If I look at this diagram here, so I could have adrenaline. Okay, remember adrenaline being an amplified form of epinephrine. We have one molecule of adrenaline binds to our receptor, makes up cyclic AMP. Because an enzyme's involved, we could make 10 molecules, so one of that makes 10 of those. And then that results in another enzyme being activated here, which produces 100 molecules of another signal molecule, which then can produce 1,000 molecules of another signal molecule here, which can ultimately release 10,000 glucose molecules. Okay, so what we can say is one signal molecule here can have an effect of producing 10,000 glucose molecules here. And the reason for that is that various enzymes are involved, okay, and because each enzyme can convert a number of substrate molecules into a number of product molecules, the signal gets amplified every time another enzyme is activated. Okay, and this is a result in an amplification in the signal. So one signal molecule, first messenger, can result in a large amount of, if you like, product being produced within inside the cell. In this case, glucose. So just returning us to the top of the slide here, just a very quick summary. You can pause here to make your own notes. Okay, so you've got to know what a first messenger is, a second messenger, and you've got to know this example of adrenaline making a second messenger called cyclic AMP. So adrenaline would be the first messenger, cyclic AMP would be the second messenger. Okay, so first messenger is, for example, is a hormone, okay, which transmits information between cells around the body. Okay, our example here, adrenaline. The second messenger is the substance that's produced as a result of the first messenger inside the target cell. Okay, example is adrenaline binding to the cell surface receptor, which switches on an enzyme called adrenal cyclase. You need to know that, the name of that, adrenal cyclase. And adrenal cyclase converts ATP in the cell into a substance called cyclic AMP, and it's that cyclic AMP that is a second messenger, and that activates enzymes within the cell which directs the metabolism of the cell. Okay, in this case adrenaline is directing the breakdown of glycogen to form glucose, a process that we call glycogenolysis, okay, which we'll come across in another slide. So moving on to the next slide. This slide deals specifically with one particular type of endocrine gland, the adrenal gland. And you've got to be able to describe the functions of the adrenal gland. So moving on quickly, the adrenal gland, first of all, where it is, you can find it on top of the kidney. I'll show you a diagram of this in a second. It's got two regions. The middle bit of the adrenal gland is called the medulla, which is involved in producing the hormone adrenaline, and the bit round the outside of the adrenal gland is called the cortex, and that is involved in producing types of hormones which are called corticosteroid hormones. Okay, and those hormones are hormones which are based around the structure of cholesterol. You might remember in F214 being taught about the structure of cholesterol and told that it was formed the basis of the structure of various steroid hormones. These hormones are fat soluble, can pass through phospholipid bilayers and have their action inside the cell and even the nucleus. What adrenaline does, it's involved in the fight or flight response, and I'll explain what that is later. The adrenal cortex is involved in producing a number of hormones called corticosteroid hormones that I've just mentioned, and there are two types, and I've actually had a spelling mistake here. One is called the mineralocorticoid, there should be a little O there, mineralocorticoid, and the example of that you should be aware of is called aldosterone, which is involved in balancing sodium ions and potassium ions in the kidney. As well as mineralocorticoid hormones, there are also glucocorticoid hormones, and the example of that you should know is cortisol, and cortisol raises blood sugar levels at times of stress by activating a process called gluconeogenesis, which is when fats and proteins are broken down to produce glucose. Okay, and that happens when blood glucose levels are low. So just a few diagrams to show you. Here's the kidney, and the adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidney like little hats, and here is the cross section of an adrenal gland. So that's a cross section of this here, and we have in the middle we have the medulla, which produces adrenaline, and then around the outside we have the cortex, which produces these corticosteroid hormones, okay, examples of which are a glucocorticoid hormone called cortisol and a mineralocorticoid hormone called aldosterone. As well as that, they produce some sex hormones, some male androgynous hormones as well, okay, but you don't really have to know about that. So moving down just a little animation here to demonstrate some of that.
The adrenal glands, located on the superior aspect of the kidneys, are responsible for the release of several hormones. The adrenal medulla, or inner portion, secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream in response to stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system to produce the body's fight or flight response. The adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids that respond to stress by increasing blood glucose. It also releases mineralocorticoids that maintain electrolyte balance by acting on the kidneys. The innermost layer of the adrenal cortex secretes small amounts of sex hormones that resemble testosterone. The adrenal glands, located on the...
Just before you think we're all completely mad, this little animation is obviously American origin, and you'll notice that they don't use the word adrenaline, they use the word epinephrine instead. Okay, so the words epinephrine and norepinephrine were used in that little animation. On this side of the Atlantic, we call epinephrine adrenaline, and we call norepinephrine noradrenaline. And then, if I look at what adrenaline causes, that it's called the fight or flight response. And here are some of the responses that we have. And you'll recognise a lot of these from your own experiences of the anxiety before an exam, or before public speaking, or before a sports contest, or whatever. So, first of all, saliva decreased flow. You get a dry mouth when you're anxious about something, and adrenaline is flowing through your circulatory system. Skin, the blood vessels taking blood to the skin constrict, vasoconstriction, so your skin goes white. The reason for that is that we're trying to direct as much blood to skeletal muscle as possible. So one of the areas that we compromise blood flow to is the skin. The other area we compromise blood flow to is the gut. So that there is less blood flowing to the stomach and to the gut. Hence the idea of butterflies in the stomach, because there's very little blood that goes to the walls of the stomach and the gut. Hence you get that funny butterfly feeling in your stomach. Other features, you get a quickening of breathing rate, presumably to increase oxygen uptake from the atmosphere, so that you can transport more oxygen to skeletal muscle. Pupils dilate, you become more mentally alert. You have slower movement of food through the bowel. You get faster heart rate, less output of digestive enzymes in the stomach, and muscles become more tense, and you have dilation of major blood vessels with an attempt to transport as much blood as possible to skeletal muscle. Okay, so these are all examples of what adrenaline do in preparing the individual for what's known as the fight or flight response. So just quickly going back to my slide at the top here, you can pause this to make some notes, but key ideas in here is where the adrenal glands are, to know that there's two bits of the adrenal gland, medulla and the cortex. The medulla produces adrenaline, whereas the cortex produces corticosteroid hormones. You should know that adrenaline is the fight or flight response, and you should know what all of these responses are in the fight or flight response. And you should know what the adrenal cortex produces, things called corticosteroid hormones of two types, mineralocorticoids. The example you should know is aldosterone, and it controls sodium and potassium balance in the blood. And you should know glucocorticoids is another example of corticosteroids. Example, cortisol, okay, which promotes a process called gluconeogenesis, which is producing glucose from non-carbohydrate sources such as fats and proteins, and that's done under stress when blood glucose is low. The fourth slide here looks at another homeostatic mechanism which involves both hormones and nerves, and it's the control of heart rate in humans. And again, like a lot of homeostatic mechanisms, has many things in common. First of all, there are sensory inputs, okay, and in this case we'll find there are two different types of sensory inputs: chemoreceptors, which detect aspects of the blood like hydrogen ion concentration, carbon dioxide and oxygen, and also things called baroreceptors, which are stretch receptors, which we can find in either the vena cava or the aorta, or the carotid artery, which detect changes in blood pressure, which also feed information back to a coordinator, which is in the medulla oblongata of the brain, a region of that called the cardiovascular center. And then we have nerves which connect our medulla oblongata to the actual effector organ, or the effector tissue in this case, which is the sinoatrial node of the heart, which can then alter the rate at which the heart beats. Okay, so the effector being the heart itself. So the heart can either increase the rate at which it beats or decrease the rate at which it beats. Okay, I'll try and explain some of that in a diagram below. So you remember from the F214 course that there's a region in the heart, which is called the SA node or the sinoatrial node, which initiates heartbeat. Remember the term myogenic, because the heartbeat can initiate its own heartbeat. It doesn't actually need nerves to initiate the heartbeat, okay, but nerves are connected to the SA node, which alter the rate at which the heart beats. And there are two inputs. There is an input which acts to slow heart rate down, which comes via a sorry, the wrong nerve here. We'll go for this nerve here, which slows heart rate down here, which is a branch of the parasympathetic nervous system. Remember, the autonomic nervous system has got two branches, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Anyway, the parasympathetic nervous system has a nerve which is called either an inhibitor nerve, or more commonly known as the vagus nerve, which acts to slow heart rate down. Conversely, we have a branch of the sympathetic nerve which acts to speed heart rate up, and the nerve that comes from the medulla oblongata to the SA node is called the accelerator nerve. Okay, so going a step backwards, we then have our coordinator, which is the cardiovascular centre, which can be found in the medulla oblongata of the brain. So this is where the nerves originate, and then they then connect with the SA node, both the accelerator nerve, which releases noradrenaline to increase heart rate, and the parasympathetic vagus nerve, which releases acetylcholine, which acts to slow heart rate. Now, the sensory input into those can either be via changes in pressure in blood vessels, and that's detected by things called baroreceptors, which detect changes in pressure, which feed information back to the medulla oblongata, or it can be via changes in blood composition of things like carbon dioxide, hydrogen ion concentration, and oxygen, which is detected by chemoreceptors, which also send sensory information back to the medulla oblongata, which act to either increase or decrease heart rate. And I've got a little animation that first of all deals with changes in pressure.
Increased blood pressure stretches the carotid arteries and aorta, causing the baroreceptors to increase their basal rate of action potential generation. Action potentials are conducted by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the cardioregulatory and vasomotor centers in the medulla oblongata. As a result of increased stimulation from the baroreceptors, the cardioregulatory center increases parasympathetic stimulation to the heart, which decreases the heart rate. Also, as a result of the increased stimulation from the baroreceptors, the cardiovascular center decreases sympathetic stimulation to the heart, which decreases heart rate and stroke volume. The vasomotor center decreases sympathetic stimulation to blood vessels, causing vasodilation. The vasodilation, along with the decreased heart rate and decreased stroke volume, bring the elevated blood pressure back toward normal. If the initial problem were a decrease in blood pressure, the activities and effects of the baroreceptors, cardiovascular center, and vasomotor center would be the opposite of what is illustrated.
So in summary there, what we're saying is that if there is too much blood returning to the heart in the vena cava, too much blood return, what happens is a signal is sent from a baroreceptor in the vena cava, which sends a signal back to the medulla oblongata, which then activates the sympathetic nervous system. So the accelerator nerve sends a message to the SA node, which causes an increase in heart rate, which, if you like, clears the backlog of blood and will consequently result in a reduction of the pressure in the venous system, okay, because we're moving blood through the heart more quickly, so by increasing heart rate. Conversely, if there's too much pressure in the arterial system, that's detected by baroreceptors in the aorta, the aortic body, and also in the carotid artery, the carotid sinus, in the wall of the carotid artery, which detects changes in pressure. So if the pressure is too high in the arterial system, a signal is sent back to the medulla oblongata, the cardiovascular centre of the medulla oblongata, which then sends a signal through the parasympathetic nervous system via the vagus nerve, which then releases acetylcholine on into the SA node, which acts to reduce heart rate, which results in a reduction in the pressure in the arterial system. Okay, so this is constantly monitoring blood pressure in the venous system and the arterial system, and responding accordingly to make sure that blood pressure is kept constant. Now, also, we have input from chemoreceptors. So as you know, if you increase amount of exercise you do, what happens is that you produce more carbon dioxide in the blood, which also acts to reduce the pH of the blood, or increase the hydrogen ion concentration, and also the oxygen concentration in the blood would go down. And that's detected by chemoreceptors, and chemoreceptors feed information back to the cardiovascular centre as well, which also act to either increase heart rate or decrease heart rate. So let's imagine you start running around, produce carbon dioxide in the blood, which also reduces the pH of the blood or increase the hydrogen ion concentration. That is detected in chemoreceptors in the aortic body, in the aorta, and also the carotid sinus, which is in the wall of the carotid artery, which takes blood to the brain. It's also detected in the hypothalamus itself, and then information is sent from all these regions to the cardiovascular centre in the medulla oblongata, and that sends a message via the sympathetic nervous system, which reduces some noradrenaline onto the SA node, which causes the heartbeat to increase. That results in more blood being pumped around the cardiovascular system, and most importantly, more blood goes to the lungs, and therefore that carbon dioxide is exchanged with the atmosphere. So we get rid of that carbon dioxide, which returns the pH to normal again. Okay, and I've got a little animation which will illustrate that as well below.
Chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies monitor blood oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. Impulses from these chemoreceptors are conducted to the control centers for heart and blood vessels via the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. Chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata monitor blood carbon dioxide and pH. Decreased blood oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, or decreased pH decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, which increases the heart rate. Decreased blood oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and decreased pH increase sympathetic stimulation of the heart, which increases heart rate and stroke volume. Increased sympathetic stimulation of blood vessels increases vasoconstriction.
And lastly, we need to look at the hormonal control of heart rate, and that's very simple, is that the sympathetic nervous system innervates the adrenal medulla, which releases the hormone adrenaline, and that circulates in the bloodstream and then is detected by adrenaline receptors in the SA node, which acts to increase heart rate. So that's part of the fight or flight response, which we looked at when we looked at the adrenaline and the adrenal gland. So in summary, we've looked at the hormonal control, adrenaline, and also we looked at nervous mechanisms of controlling heart rate, initiated either by changes in pressure in the venous or arterial system via baroreceptors, or by the composition of blood with respect to hydrogen ion concentration or carbon dioxide and oxygen concentration detected by chemoreceptors. Now both baroreceptors and chemoreceptors feed information back to the cardiovascular centre of the medulla oblongata, which can either send messages to increase heart rate via the accelerator nerve, which is part of the sympathetic nervous system, or can act to reduce heart rate by sending messages by the vagus nerve, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So that ends this screencast.